Okay, so in this particular video we're going to be looking at the whole area of a subsidy instead of putting a tax or a quota in order to subsidise the domestic producers and restrict the amount of free trade, i.e. restrict the amount of imports. So it's important that you're able to compare a subsidy with a tariff and with a quota. Okay, and there's some two really big points that you've got to bring out when you do that. All right, so let's have a look at what happens. Well, without any protectionism and without any subsidy, etc., this is your world price, and so you remember that the firms in the domestic industry will supply OQ1. The demand is at B, and so therefore the imports are the distance between those, and so without any subsidies, domestic industry supplies this amount. All of this lot get imported because the demand is up at Q2. So what happens if we put a subsidy on? There it is. So hopefully you saw that the subsidy is going to bring the domestic supply curve down here. So this is now the new domestic supply curve with a subsidy. And the combined supply curve, remember I was saying to you before that that's the best way to actually work this out. This is the combined supply curve, this green line here. In other words, the domestic suppliers will be supplying the market here, and then we'll move on to the world supply. So the demand is here still, because you still have the same price, and that's really important. Prices don't change. But we will now say, well, you know, what happens between here and here? Well, before the world was supplying, say, a quantity here, because that's the world price, and this was the domestic price. Now the domestic price is lower. They're willing and able to supply at this price because of that subsidy. This then becomes the domestic supply as well. So the domestic supply rises from here to here, okay, which therefore reduces the amount of the imports, which is the whole point of the subsidy. Okay, however, from the government's point of view, there's no tariff revenue when you're comparing it with a tariff, and in fact, you'll see that the subsidy is actually going to cost the government. Okay, but you get the impact of an increase in the domestic output, a reduction in the amount of the imports, and a key advantage is no rise in price. So no inflation, no consumer surplus loss, etc. Okay, so that's a big difference between the two. So what about the producer surplus? Well, I'll try and sort of show it to you. This here was the old producer surplus. I think we knew that from the previous diagrams. And all we're suggesting in this diagram is that because the output has now gone up to this point, Q3, then the producer surplus, remember they're receiving this price, this is the price of these goods, they're receiving this price, they were willing and able to supply down here, and so therefore the argument is that this whole box here is the producer surplus. So the difference in the box, okay, the lighter green one here is the difference in the box. The difference in the box is actually the gain in producer surplus, but because often you don't need that diagram, it will depend how you actually draw it, what actually this box turns out like. So if you're worried about that, just don't draw it, just say producer surplus rises, because they get the same price, but they're getting more output. Okay, all right. What's the effect on the government? So this is the big drawback of a subsidy. So if you remember, the amount per unit of the subsidy is this shift in the supply curve. So the government pay a subsidy per unit of this distance here, equivalent to that shift, on all of that domestic output. And so that's a cost to the government. So this is the output that the firms are producing. This is the amount of the subsidy the government are giving on all of that output, and so the box is the amount of the subsidy that the government have to pay. So an advantage of subsidies, no hike in prices, no loss of consumer surplus, but the cost of subsidies is going to be that it's going to cost the government instead of, let's say you had a tariff where the government received revenue. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of how subsidies work.